Now that we've seen kind of some initial criticisms of that Fisher is going to raise against Williams's analysis, we want to focus a little bit more clearly on how he's going to deal with the problem that Elena Macropolis is supposed to present to us. Remember, Fisher's target is going to be that attractiveness condition that Williams identifies. Williams thinks that there's just no way that an immortal existence can ever look attractive to us from our sort of present position, because we're eventually going to run out of categorical desires. We're going to cease to have projects that sort of make us happy and give us reasons to go on living. And Fisher thinks that Williams's reasons for concluding this have to do with his sort of confusing two different kinds of pleasures that might be available to a person. Fisher's going to draw a distinction between what he calls self-exhausting pleasures and what he calls repeatable pleasures. And part of Fisher's point here is to try to show that if the only kind of pleasures we had were self-exhausting pleasures, Williams would be right, that eventually we would run out of these categorical desires and thus run out of reasons to live. But what Williams doesn't take account of is the fact that repeatable pleasures can also give us reasons to live, and that's going to be the basis for claiming that immortality actually is attractive. So to see how that works, let's just get clear about this distinction between self-exhausting and repeatable pleasures. Now, self-exhausting pleasures are defined as just pleasures that once you experience them, you tend to not want to do them again, even in the very distant future. An example of this might be something like climbing Mount Whitney, which is a very tall mountain in California, in order to prove to yourself that you can do it. Now notice, this is the kind of pleasure that is self-exhausting, not only because once you do it, you probably won't want to do it again, but just because of the way that it's put, to prove to yourself that you can do it. Once you've proven that, that's it. You've proven it. You don't need to sort of do it again to prove to yourself that you can do it. So the enjoyment of accomplishing something to prove to yourself that it can be done, that's not a kind of enjoyment that you can repeat, because you've sort of already gotten, once you prove to yourself that you can climb Mount Whitney, proving to yourself that you can still do it, the following week is just not going to be as enjoyable, as pleasurable for you. Now Fisher says, and you might think that this is true, you might sort of disagree with him, he says often these kinds of pleasures are disappointing. They're not really what they were cracked up to be. We sort of think that, if the pleasure is in sort of beating something at some kind of competitive endeavor, we tend to think those things are going to be more rewarding and more enjoyable than they turn out to be a lot of the time. We're not as sort of pleased with them once they're done. And Fisher says, look, even when these aren't disappointing, we still don't have a desire to experience them again once we've done it. So pleasures that involve wanting to prove yourself, do something comparative, like being the best at something or winning a race, once you sort of establish yourself, once you experience the pleasure of that, that pleasure has sort of exhausted itself. It's no longer going to be pleasurable in the same sort of way. And notice that these are going to be, if these are the only kind of pleasures we had, if all pleasures were self-exhausting, Williams would be right. Like, there would be a point at which we've run out. We've exhausted every pleasure that we could have. But what Williams doesn't take note of, and Fisher thinks is really important, is that we also have repeatable pleasures. Now, these are pleasures that we tend to find pleasurable when they occur, but you also want to experience them again. Like, just because it's happened before doesn't mean that you no longer enjoy them. They don't have this sort of short shelf life that self-exhausting pleasures have. You can do them over and over and enjoy them every time. Examples are sex, eating fine meals, drinking good wine, listening to good music, seeing great art. These are all things that you can do over and over, and you enjoy them every time. It's not as though, once you've done these things, that's it. They no longer sort of give you any enjoyment, any pleasure. Fisher also notes certain kinds of intellectual pursuits, and certain kinds of artistic performance might also be this way. We do them over, if you love to play the violin, the enjoyment you get from playing the violin doesn't sort of go away once you once you have played it a few times, you actually sort of enjoy it more the more you do it in a lot of cases. Now, you should notice that these are, to some extent, relativized to individuals. Like, what count as self-exhausting and repeatable pleasures for different people. There's going to be a lot of variation, but there's also going to be sort of a core set of self-exhausting and repeatable pleasures that apply to everyone. And Fisher thinks that this distinction is really important. He doesn't spend a lot of time arguing that this distinction between kinds of pleasures exists. He thinks it's just a fact about us, that we have some pleasures that we sort of only enjoy on a one-time or very limited basis, and then we have these pleasures that are enjoyable over time. And he doesn't want to suggest that, one type of pleasure is better or worse. He doesn't have this notion of higher versus lower pleasures, for example, that we see other philosophers distinguish between. John Stuart Mill does this. He talks about sort of intellectual pursuits as higher pleasures and sort of food and drink as lower pleasures, for example. Fisher doesn't think that's the right way to think about this. He says, look, really what's important is whether the pleasure is self-exhausting or repeatable. And Fisher does want to give Williams credit where credit is due here. He wants to say, look, if the only pleasures we had were self-exhausting, Williams would be right. It would just be the case that an immortal life would be unattractive. We'd run out of things to give us reasons to go on living. But repeatable pleasures, luckily, are also the sorts of things that can give us reasons to go on living. These are sort of the things that make life great. And so long as they're spaced properly, you don't want to eat a gourmet meal every single night. You will sort of stop appreciating how good the food is. You want to throw a little mac and cheese in there once in a while, just because you want to get that comparison. You don't want to go to the art museum every day. But if you sort of space your repeatable pleasures properly, you'll get enough enjoyment from them that these can, and Fisher thinks they will, give you sort of ongoing reasons to live, just into the future. Now notice here, Fisher's not dealing with that first identity condition. Fisher's just holding our character fixed. He's saying, look, even if you just remained the same kind of person you are right now, an immortal life where you got to sort of experience all the repeatable pleasures that you find enjoyable, that would be enough to give you a reason to go on living. And Fisher also thinks this is where we might have some room for response to Williams's criticism of kind of theological conceptions of immortality, where immortality is occurring in a kind of heaven or something like that. Because Fisher mentions, he talks about this in more detail in the article. He gives us this example from Kierkegaard, but we can sort of simplify that discussion, because Fisher's point is really just that spiritual and religious experiences can also be repeatable pleasures for people. They can those are the kinds of things that people don't sort of tire of doing, right? Some of those spiritual and religious experiences are going to be self-exhausting. Once you, feeling like you're in the presence of God for the first time or something like that, you're not going to get that sort of unique enjoyment of the first experience. The first time you meditate and it really seems like it's working, like you're really getting something out of it that you've never gotten out of it before. That sort of unique first-timer experience is not going to be retained. But the enjoyment seems to be repeatable. People seem to enjoy having these kinds of experiences with some degree of frequency. And so Fisher thinks, look, that's gonna, the combination of sort of repeatable pleasures plus this unique feature of, the enjoyment some people get from religious and spiritual experience. If we, assume that there is that kind of component in an immortal afterlife, you might think that's enough to sort of keep us. You might think that that's the answer to Williams's question of, like, what is it about an immortal afterlife? Well, it's that the level and depth of the spiritual religious experience you can have is just much greater because of the kind of place you're in. You might think that that's the answer that someone might want to give to Williams's criticism of those kinds of conceptions of immortality. So the point here is just that even if self-exhausting pleasures will eventually cease to give us categorical desires, we'll sort of run out of those in the way Elena Macropolis does, repeatable pleasures, as well as for those who sort of find this important, the pleasures of spiritual and religious experience, those do seem to be capable of giving us categorical desires that Williams says are necessary for making an immortal life attractive. We seem to be able to get the reasons we need to make life worth living. Okay, with that said, the question is, go ahead and move on to the question. It's going to ask you to look at a list of sort of potential pleasures or enjoyments, identify which doesn't count as a repeatable pleasure. It's sort of a test to see how well you understand and can apply this concept. And then we'll conclude by just talking a little bit about how Williams discusses that second criteria, or that first criteria, the identity condition, which has to do with changes in character. Fisher has something to say about that as well.